There was a god who refused to spill blood. In a world where the sun demanded sacrifice, where the gods themselves had bled to set the cosmos in motion, where every temple in every city was built with the understanding that something living must be offered to keep the sky from falling, there was one god who said no, who fed his people corn and flowers instead of war, who taught them to read the stars, to work gold, to write, to build, to pray without dying. His name was Quetzalcoatl, the Feathered Serpent, and his story does not end well. It never does, for the ones who love humanity too much. He was wind and light wearing a body. His name combined two things that should never meet. Quetzal, the sacred green bird of freedom, whose feathers could not be taken without releasing it, and Coatl, the serpent that moved through the earth itself. He was both flight and depth, heaven and ground. In Toltec and Aztec tradition, he was not simply a god among gods. He was the god of knowledge, of civilization, of the morning star. He presided over Talin, the great and perfect city that existed before memory clouded it into legend, the city where maize grew in colors, where cotton bloomed already died, where the people wanted for nothing and killed no one for the sky. He was also a priest king, a man and a god at once, the way the most sacred things often refuse to be just one thing. And he had a rival, a dark mirror of everything he was. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of night, of sorcery, of the obsidian blade, who held in his hand a mirror that showed every truth a person most feared about themselves. If Quetzalcoatl was the morning star, bright, generous, nourishing, impossible to look at directly, then Tezcatlipoca was the moonless night sky, necessary, consuming, filled with teeth. Between these two gods, everything human was stretched. Talin under Quetzalcoatl was the memory of what the world was supposed to be. Maize of every color stood taller than any man had seen. Cotton grew from the ground already red, already yellow, already blue, as if the earth itself knew what colors the people needed and provided them without being asked. Turquoise, jade, gold, and silver came out of the ground in abundance. The people were artists and builders and scholars. They read the movement of planets. They understood that time was not a river flowing in one direction, but a great wheel of cycles turning through each other, and they built calendars of such precision that we are still impressed by them today. And at the center of all of it, Quetzalcoatl, performing penance instead of demanding it, drawing his own blood as the offering rather than asking others to bleed for him, feeding the fire, refusing to sacrifice human life to keep the sun moving. He believed there was another way. He believed the sun could be kept alive without the knife. Tezcatlipoca watched all of this from the night. He came the way destruction always comes, not openly, not as a declared enemy, but as a friend, as a gift-bearer, as the one who says, I only want to show you something. He came to Quetzalcoatl in the night, and he said, I have brought you something. I want you to look at yourself. He held out his smoking mirror. Quetzalcoatl looked. What he saw in that mirror, the stories do not fully say. This is one of those silences in mythology that speaks louder than any explanation. What is a god of light, a god of knowledge, a god who has devoted his entire existence to the elevation and protection of human beings? What does such a god see when a mirror of absolute truth is held in front of his face in the dark? He saw something that broke him. Some versions say he saw his own face as an old man, as something withered and fallen from its ideal. Some say he saw simply himself, and that himself was not what he had imagined himself to be, that the gap between who Quetzalcoatl believed he was and who he actually was, seen without the mercy that a god usually extends to his own reflection, was simply too much to bear. He turned away from the mirror, and something inside him, something that had held the city and the people and the long refusal to spill blood in place, cracked. Tezcatlipoca had not finished. He came again, this time not with a mirror, but with a cup. Pulque, the fermented drink of the maguey plant, white and thick and powerful. The drink the priests of Tallinn were forbidden. The drink that loosened the boundary between who you were in the daytime and who you became when that daytime self was briefly suspended. Tezcatlipoca offered it to Quetzalcoatl as medicine. He said, "You are not well. You are suffering. Drink this. Just a taste. For your health." Quetzalcoatl refused. Then he drank a taste. Then 4 cups. Then 5. And the god of knowledge, the god of civilization, the god who had held his city in the light for longer than any story can precisely measure, got drunk. He sent for his sister Quetzalcoatl, who was also a priestess bound by the same vows of temperance and self-discipline. She came. Tezcatlipoca gave her pulque too. They drank together. They forgot their vows. They forgot the rituals of the evening, the prayers that maintained the order of the cosmos, the careful attention to the sacred calendar that kept the world oriented and safe. In the morning they woke knowing what they had done. And Quetzalcoatl, not Tezcatlipoca, not anyone else, but Quetzalcoatl himself, in the brutal clarity of what comes after the night's loosening passes, understood that he had broken the covenant that made him who he was. He had not been tricked into committing evil. He had been shown his own weakness and had chosen it freely. The mirror had done its work not when he looked into it, but in the hours that followed, when the image of himself he had seen cracked the foundation beneath everything he had built, and Tezcatlipoca simply handed him the cup. What followed was swift and terrible. Quetzalcoatl dressed in his priestly robes. He set them on fire and burned them. He took his sacred feathered headdress and buried it. He planted in the ground the trees he had tended, the garden of Tallinn he had spent an eternity cultivating, and turned to look at them one last time. Then he left. The journey toward the coast was a death march and a god's farewell simultaneously. Everywhere he walked, things ended. The birds he had loved, the quetzal, the cotingas, the toucans, the bright impossible creatures of Tallinn's gardens, they followed him as far as the mountain pass, and then turned back, unable to cross into the cold air beyond. They died there at the mountain, the texts say. They died at the place called Poyatlin, the place of mist, where the altitude was too much for them, and they fell. Quetzalcoatl wept for them. He stood at the mountain pass and wept for the birds. He kept walking. He buried his jewels and his gold at a place called Coatzapalco. He turned the cacao trees he had tended into desert mesquite, took the gift of the cacao, the chocolate, the food of the gods that he had brought to humanity, and transformed it into something that could not be cultivated anymore in those lands. He took back what he had given. The way a person, leaving for good, clears everything personal from the room they lived in, so that nothing of themselves remains there for others to inhabit. He crossed deserts. He crossed mountains. He descended toward the eastern coast and the great water, the shore of the eastern sea, the place the texts call Tlapalin, the red land, the land of color, or perhaps simply the horizon. Quetzalcoatl stopped. He built a raft. Some versions say the raft was made of serpents, woven and bound together, a vessel of the same creatures his name was half made of. He stepped onto it. He pushed off from the shore of the known world. The sea took him east. Some versions say he burned on his raft, that he immolated himself over the ocean and rose as the morning star, Venus, the planet that dies beneath the horizon and rises again, the eternal cycle of disappearance and return that the Mesoamerican peoples tracked with extraordinary precision, that they built their calendars around, that they understood as the signature of the feathered serpent written across the sky in light. But the version that changed history says something different. It says he did not die. It says he sailed east, and he promised, standing at the prow of his serpent raft, looking back at the shore where his people stood watching him go, that he would return, that when the calendar turned to the right year, When the cycle of time brought Quetzalcoatl one reed, his sacred birth year, back to the front of the great wheel, he would come back from the east. He would come back from the east wearing wind and feathers, and the morning starred. And the year one reed, 1519 by the European calendar, a fleet of ships appeared on the eastern horizon of the Aztec world. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico. The accounts of what followed, the accounts we have from both the Spanish side and the Aztec side, filtered through trauma and conquest, and the deliberate burning of indigenous records, are complicated and contested, and we must hold them carefully, because the story of whether Moctezuma II actually believed Cortés was the returning Quetzalcoatl has been used and abused by historians on every side, sometimes to blame the Aztecs for their own destruction, sometimes to explain what cannot be explained except by an enormous empire meeting a new kind of weapon and a new kind of disease simultaneously. But the myth was there, the prophecy was there. The expectation of return from the east in the year one reed was woven into the Aztec understanding of time and cosmos so deeply that when something arrived from the east in that year wearing things that glittered and moved in ways nothing native to those shores moved, the story and the reality pressed against each other, catastrophically, in a collision that changed the world. Whether Moctezuma believed, whether he was paralyzed by the myth, or was simply managing an impossible political situation with the tools available to him, we cannot fully know. What we know is this: the God who loved humanity too much, who was destroyed not by his enemy's strength, but by the revelation of his own weakness, who sailed away promising to return. His absence and his promised return created a wound in the world's story that something terrible eventually stepped into. Quetzalcoatl is one of the most documented deities in Mesoamerican religion, worshipped across centuries and cultures: Olmec, Toltec, Aztec, Mayan in his aspect as Kukulkan, and what every tradition preserves about him at the core is the same idea dressed in different feathers. He is the God who believes human beings are worth more than their blood. In a cosmological system that genuinely understood sacrifice as the mechanism that kept the sun moving, not as metaphor, not as symbol, but as literal cosmic necessity, Quetzalcoatl was the persistent minority argument that there was another way, that knowledge and cultivation and art and astronomy and corn could feed the sun as well as blood could, that the highest offering was not a human heart, but a human life, well-lived, building and learning, and creating the things that only human beings can create. He lost that argument. The sun's hunger won. The knife won. The empire built on military expansion and sacrifice won. And Quetzalcoatl went east on a raft made of serpents. But he was not forgotten. He was so not forgotten that 500 years after his exile, when something arrived from the direction he had promised to return from, the entire structure of an empire trembled with the possibility that the God who had loved them too much to ask them to bleed had finally come home. He hadn't. What came instead was worse than anything a god of the night and the smoking mirror had ever managed. But the love was real. The refusal was real. The God who wept for his birds at the mountain pass, who buried his own gold rather than leave it for anyone else, who turned the cacao trees to mesquite so the land would remember what it had lost. That God, that stubborn, beautiful, impossible argument that humanity deserves something better than the knife, was real. And the morning star still rises in the east every dawn, the same as it always has, the same as it did before the ships came, the same as it will long after every empire that has ever demanded blood from its people has turned to dust. Ancient stories, eternal truth. This has been SERA Mythology.